New Orleans has always been a large place of interest for me. Ever since I visited in 2022, anything that reminds me of Louisiana or New Orleans still haunts me to this day. The food, the music, the aesthetically pleasing Spanish architecture, the culture that injects itself into the overall whole, everything. But I think what attracts me most is the opposite to the overall postcard description of New Orleans. The not so kid friendly and most of all depressing, angsty, and but soulful music that congregates the crevices in the downtown and streets of New Orleans. This music is what interests me the most, since I realize most of the bands that I listen to today is found in this place of oddities and is inspired by this place of oddities. And I want to show you, the audience, why that this place is such an compelling but dark city that influences the music I listen to on a daily basis. I will first describe how New Orleans formed this darker identity by looking at its history, voodoo culture, and tendencies to develop and attract musical talent. Since its inception, New Orleans has had a boiling pot of different cultures that clash to make the perfect set of diverse and interesting society. The first interesting culture that derived from it was the French and the Spanish architecture, and somewhat the culture. The Spanish were the ones to make the the houses and stuff like that down in New Orleans, the buildings. Many people mistake that the French did it, but actually it was the Spanish who did it first, and that was in 1718. The French were the ones to bring most of the ideas and the food culture along with them, having the beignets and the things that we have there today. The second was the culture of the African American slaves that developed the voodoo culture. As a way to rebel against Christian and other religious ideals, um, and also to the effect of slavery. This use of voodoo culture, which took some ideas from African religious beliefs and added some interesting twists, added to the allure the dark side of New Orleans. This kind of voodoo culture has always been more of a religion than anything. People make it out to be more of a kind of like very very occultish kind of thing, but it's really more of a religious kind of thing. But it does still make New Orleans that much darker. The cruel act of colonialism, slavery, inducted a certain type of reaction to the plantation hymns that we see from the Black Americans. One of the first sightings of disparity living under into a and this these hymns are now a constructive art that can soon influence many individuals. The third interesting aspect is the musical birthplace slash inspiration of many kinds of music like jazz, rock and roll, metal, and blues. Once the hymns of slavery were over, jazz and blues started to take a hold of the current culture. And the development of things like rock and roll had started to take its grasp on New Orleans. With the inspiration of blues, rock and roll, this would inspire future metal artists as well as the influence of the darker side of New Orleans itself. I would like to explain some of the expressions that took place in New Orleans. Although some might think that New Orleans is party central, we can see from the music depression, angst, turmoil, and criminal tendencies that come along with living in a place of such darkness. Music such as jazz and the blues show the hard use of drugs, depression, and turmoil of the human mind. Because of these effects, culture has, as the city has of these artists, it produces a different and unusual sound for most of the places. A lot of these jazz and blues had a lot of dark topics such as drug use and sex and all these other kinds of darker things to the story, which adds to the musical differentness and the musical prowess there. This unusual sound stems from the plantation hymns as well, that ignited this use of musical expressions through the struggles of an African American living in New Orleans. So these unusual plantation hymns are they add to the musical culture that our New Orleans has as a whole. which is jazz and the blues and rock and roll. The darker culture is also developed through the overall history of poverty and death that the city has covered over the years, such as the cemeteries that are in pockets everywhere in the city. They're everywhere, and you can see them pop up everywhere. There's a lot of gravestones that add to the darkness of the city that make it that much darker, and as well as the weather. The weather has also gives it a kind of a darker sense of being. Other genres that were not particularly or not directly from New Orleans are influenced as well, such as metal. Sludge metal is one of the ways New Orleans has shifted a genre to its own unique sound and will. Since so many metal bands came from New Orleans, the city is associated directly with metal. And the sludge genre metal specifically is deeply engraved in that culture. Many bands that come from them now identify with New Orleans, with the New Orleans metal scene, such as Down, Pantera, um, and Acid Bath. All those bands come from the New Orleans metal scene. In conclusion, New Orleans is such a compelling but dark city that influences the music I listen to on a daily basis. And the history that influences that music and the city makes it more understandable from my point of view. From metal to jazz to rock, New Orleans will always be a dark and interesting place for me.